Continuing now with contention number 11. This takes us back to the theme that preoccupied us in the previous session about the mentality that rejects the traditional usul about making things easier and that assumes that authenticity consists in narrowness. Quite often one of the psychological drivers here is people's fear of diversity. The modern world tends to impose a single culture as its outcome, which some cultural critics like Slavoj Žižek will refer to as the monoculture, the irony of a liberal world in which multiple lifestyles seem to be enabled, but which in practice produces an increasing uniformity of political and social beliefs. The same thing can happen in the context of religion, but in the context of religion this is not a natural outcome, it is an unnatural consequence of a fear-driven set of fatwa choices. So, defining our terms, fundamentalism is a term that is not indigenous to our tradition and can be borrowed only subject to clear caveats. In this case we would say it refers to cutting the cord that binds us to the earliest generations, that consists in the ijaza system of countless generations of transformed and pure ulama, and an attempt to use our own minds to try and make sense of the Quran and the Sunnah with their complex data for ourselves. It might seem like an absurd thing to do. The Ummah has strained every nerve for 14 centuries to try and understand the Quran and the Sunnah correctly, and to try and perpetuate the Islam of the earliest generations, and to set all of that brilliant tradition to one side and to say, I can do it better, it seems a form of madness. It doesn't make sense at all. But some people have got themselves into that situation for whatever reason, and it implies, of course, drastic backbiting of the ulama of Islam, to say that they were not faithfully committed to following the way of the Salaf, even though they knew it better than anybody now does, is insulting as well as ridiculous. Everybody seeks to follow the Islam of the first 3 generations. And that's not a contested view. We agree on it. The Azhar, you memorize the text Jawharat al-Tawheed, which says, وَكُلُّ خَيْرٍ فِي اتِّبَاعِ مَنْ سَلَفٍ وَكُلُّ شَرٍ فِي ابْتِدَاعِ مَنْ خَلَفٍ. Every good consists in the following of the first generations, and every evil consists in the innovations of later generations. That's the position of the Azhar, that's the position of Sunni Islam, that's the position of the Hanafis and the Malikis and the Hanbalis and the Shafi'is and the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. It's everybody's position that is Sunni Islam, to follow the earliest generations. And this is prophetically mandated. The question is, do we have a way of proving that the ulama's understanding of the first generation is inferior to our own understanding? Of course we don't, but some people like to think that actually they can get it right where all of the Shafi'is got it wrong. And this is part of the unbalanced nature of the modern mind in many places, and this backbiting of the ulama is profoundly subversive and of course plays into the desires of the ego. What does the ego desire? Desires power, status, superiority, to be in charge. It's that pharaonic possibility within us. In the context of religion, the Fir'aun within wants to be up high on a throne, looking down on all of the Malikis and the Hanafis and the Maturidis and saying, he's right, he's wrong, I know best. My understanding of the way of the early Muslims is better than all of the ulamas. All the ulama of the Ottoman Empire, I know better than them. I know better than Ibn Kamal with his multiple fatwas. I know better than Abu Sa'ud Effendi. I know better than Shivi Zadeh. I know better than Mullah Khusraw and his focus on the usul. Me. Ultimately, it's about the self and about gratifying the self in the face of our sense of smallness, in the face of this mighty heritage. We don't like to feel small, we like to be big, and so we make it small by considering it inferior and considering ourselves to be better. The self becomes sovereign over all of the ulama of Islam. The self believes that it knows the way of the Salaf better, even if the self happens not to be able to even name more than 10 different hadith collections, and there's hundreds known to the ulama. It's clearly absurd, but the ego is a powerful thing. So that's what we would understand as fundamentalism in an Islamic context. Rejecting the wisdom of the ulama in favor of one's own personal judgment. Sometimes this is associated, well, it's a very unusual position in our heritage, and for good reason, with Ibn Taymiyyah's understanding of fitrah. Ibn Taymiyyah purports to be against the idea of a religious elite. He thinks that the ordinary believer can understand the Quran and the Sunnah through his fitrah, in which he has tremendous confidence. And so the fitrah of the believer knows which is the correct fatwa interpretation of a bunch of hadith that seem to be in conflict with each other. Or the fitrah of the believer knows what is the real meaning of a difficult Arabic term that appears in the Quran or in a hadith or in the saying of one of the Sahaba. And this is inspiring to a lot of modern Muslims who wish to cut free of the ulama system and put themselves in charge. My fitrah. The problem, of course, is that it ends up being a very subjective concept, because what my fitrah interprets as being the meaning of the Quran and the Sunnah turns out very often to be different to what the guy next door in the masjid is saying his fitrah is guiding him to in its understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah. The fitrah, yes, but the fitrah as a basis for fatwa choice, no. That's not how Islamic scholarship works. But unfortunately, some people read or misread Ibn Taymiyyah to be saying this. And of course, the ego really gets off on this, because it's saying, I'm so pure, I'm so good, I'm so right, that my fitrah knows the Quran and the Sunnah better than Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and Jalaluddin Suyuti and Imam al-Ghazali and Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. And that's a big injection of adrenaline for anybody's ego. And that's why in our ego age, so many people are attracted to this fundamentalism. But from the point of view of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, it's a completely subversive and divisive modality. Now, where then does the monoculture come in? If we're saying that the traditional ulama generally respect each other, and in the Ottoman Empire they took different views, but they did respect each other. And nowadays, people who are following the fitrah are killing each other because of their different understandings of what the Salaf were about. Surely we would say that that modern Taymiyyah understanding is the one that's going to produce diversity. And traditional Islam tends towards a monoculture, but it doesn't seem to be like that. In fact, what happens is that by reducing the possibility of the substantive incorporation of urf into people's lives, everybody is forced into a form of Islam that is indifferently and uniformly Arab and Arabian. That the diversity of the Ummah, which is part of its historic strength, is eliminated in favor of a reading of the Salaf that focuses specifically on their Arabness. So people become Abu this and Abu that, march around in Arab clothes, they affect Arabisms in what they eat and how they deal with each other. None of this is required. None of this is required. That's a misunderstanding. That's a fundamentalism that throttles diversity. Part of the strength historically of Islam is that it promoted diversity and enabled the different member peoples of the Ummah to flourish in terms that were particular to themselves. So Islam comes to the Persian people, who before Islam's arrival had had a literature, but it's really a few Avestan hymns and Pahlavi texts, and it's dry celebrations of the victories of kings and not very inspiring. Islam comes to them, even though its scripture is Arabic, and immediately, within a few generations, Persian becomes the world's #1 poetic language. From Firdausi to Attar to Nizami to whoever, an extraordinary efflorescence. Fundamentalism has to amputate all of that and can't respect any of it. massively impoverishing the Turath, or the heritage of the Muslims, much to the delight of Islam's enemies, one of whose claims is that those things happen despite Islam rather than because of it. And the same happens to Turkish literature. The wonders of Turkish literature, and we've been looking at a fairly early example, the Yusuf Zulaykha of Kemal Pashazadeh, was the consequence of the Islamization of the Turkish people. So it had very little by way of higher culture before Islam came. And so it is for Hausa, for Wolof, for Fulfulde, for Malay, for Achenese, for the languages of the Ummah generally, that the particularities of those people seem to have been fertilized and purified by the alchemical touch of Islam's Tawheed. None of that happens in the context of modern fundamentalism that is usually, almost invariably, culturally sterile. The great diversity of classical Sunni Islam produces great literature, produces great architecture, produces great styles of tajweed, produces great calligraphies, produces a wonderful richness, but the modern fundamentalist readings of Islam never produce anything that can remotely compete. Their architecture, ugly and impoverished. Their calligraphy, second-rate at best. Their tonalities in Quranic recitation, droning, nasal, egotistic, disagreeable. And this is something that one consistently finds. Fundamentalism represents the termination of beauty and also represents the termination of diversity. And this also represents a challenge to the prophetic statement, وَجُعِلَتْ لِيَ الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا. The whole earth has been made a place of prostration for me. The Muslim has to be not only in a time when he prays, but also in a place, because the quality of the location is significant, and the architectural commemorations of Muslim worship have always acknowledged the particularity of the place, the use of local materials, the acknowledgement of the distinct orientation of the Qibla regarding sunrise and sunset in different places. There is a localization despite the universality of our practices. So the idea of urf and ada is fundamental. There is such a thing as Turkish Islam, there is Persian Islam, there is Uzbek Islam, there is Malay Islam, because al-ada muhakkama, as the ulama of usul agree, the adat, the customs that people have, to the extent that they don't overthrow something that's known to be true from revelation, are also regarded as being something that is sanctioned Islamically and something that is people's right. Recently we had in England somebody who won a British Muslims award of some kind and said, oh, I'm not a British Muslim, I'm just a Muslim who lives in Britain. Well, if you read the books of usul, you will find that yes, we are all hyphenated in that way. There are Arab Muslims and British Muslims and Indian Muslims. Everybody has their own cultural coordinates, and the ada is something that is entirely legitimate and validated and can be upheld in a court of law by a qadi. It's a significant principle of Sharia. In some jurisdictions, it's one of the most significant grounds for the qadi to give his rulings. So this idea of Islam as being a monoculture, promoted by some enemies of the religion, one might add, and people like V.S. Naipaul like to see Islam as an Arab imperialism, fits with the fundamentalist vision, but certainly does not fit with the classic realities of Islamic diversity. One sees with distress in places in China, for instance, where some Arabs have settled as part of the oil prospecting industry, their insistence on the destruction of the traditional Chinese mosques and their replacement with the usual kind of concrete mock Mamluk style structure, which they think is somehow more authentic. But this is not the case. All of these cultural forms have a local particularity, and none of them is intrinsically superior to another. So this idea of the fundamentalism's nervousness about diversity is something that is having a huge impact and really shrinking Islam. So back to Kemal Pashazadeh, he actually has a little book about this. رسالة في بيان الأصل في الاختلاف أن يكون من حجة وبرهان أو عن اختلاف عصر وزمان. As you can tell from the title, this one is in Arabic. So he's talking about the principle, clarifying the principle of ikhtilaf, different opinions amongst Muslims and jurists in particular. Is this because their inference, their usuli reasoning from the Quran and the Hadith and possibly other sources of Sharia logically leads to there being a plurality of different opinions? Or is it because in different circumstances, whether it be Imam Malik in Medina or Imam Abu Hanifa in Baghdad, people are engaging with different environments, and therefore the ikhtilaf is based on that. In other words, asr was a man, the age and the time. And he says, Al-aslu fil ikhtilaf an yakuna an hujja wa burhan wa qad yakunu an ikhtilaf asr wa zaman. So he says the basic principle is that the reason for the divergence of the scholars is that the usul lead to a multiplicity of conclusions. But it is also possible for it to be based on people's circumstances. What we would call theory choice or perhaps fatwa choice does depend on the cognitive frame with which you're operating. Your sense of how you justly handle, for instance, the inheritance of grandparents, which is an issue in the Sharia, how much they inherit if a grandson dies, is going to depend inevitably on what you're used to, your cultural formation, your sense of what is just. Nobody can adopt a view from nowhere. Everybody has a point of view when they're issuing fatwas, and this, for Kamal Pashazadeh, is not a problem, because you have to know your time and you have to know the people you're speaking to, and you're part of that as well. So we have, for instance, the question of the Sahaba themselves disagreeing amongst themselves. This again is part of the reason why fundamentalism, it doesn't actually operate in an Islamic context, because the texts are too difficult and sometimes mutashabihat, difficult, ambiguous, to be open to a single unarguable interpretation. Very often, verses of the Quran and Hadiths are open to very many interpretations that are present amongst the Salaf themselves. So the fatwa of a companion is binding, but quite often we find the companions giving different fatwas. And the Holy Prophet indicates this for those who are listening by saying, Ashabi kan nujum bi ayyihim uqtadaytum ihtadaytum. My companions are like stars. Whichever of them you are guided by, you will be rightly guided. In that, you already have the idea that ikhtilaf is legitimized in Islam, and there can be a diversity of opinions. So we have this principle which is there really in the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah of the legitimacy of ikhtilaf. That the Quran and the Sunnah themselves are documents that invite the Ummah to take a range of opinions. Because of the psychological tensions and insecurities that generate fundamentalism, some Muslims nowadays feel anxious when they see the scholars taking more than one view on a subject. They think that this is scandalous, that the scripture's integrity has been impugned because the scriptures don't seem to be clear. Those ambiguities, as Imam Shatibi reminds us, are intentional. It is the divine intention that there should be multiplicity, and Ibn Kamal is only one of countless ulama to affirm that. This ikhtilaf is divinely willed. It is not a scandal that there are four madhabs. It is not a scandal that there are lots of different opinions within the madhabs. This is part of the way in which Islam is designed to be. But the fundamentalist mindset wants to find a single solution to everything. Why? What's the appeal? Partly psychological fear of the confusion of multiplicity. Very often people are religious nowadays because they are refugees from the unbearable complexity of modernity. They want a comfort zone, and they think if I adopt a religious frame for life, I'll be able to see everything in black and white terms and have a simple button to press with respect to any challenge that the world might throw at me. Religion's not supposed to be that. A spiritual refuge from love of dunya, for sure. But it's not supposed to be a simple place where you go where you find a single unified answer to all of the questions of your life. That's not how a great world religion is meant to be or ever has been. And this sometimes can throw them into alarm and confusion and dismay. So sometimes you find some of them very skeptical of any classical interpretation of Islam that does find it fine that the ulama should be permanently in disagreement about certain things. And so they incline to a form of Islam that says only one view is correct and everything else is clearly a betrayal of the scriptures. And this again is a kind of tanattu or fanaticism of the kind that the Holy Prophet ﷺ is warning us against. Halaka al-mutanatti'un, may the fanatics perish. And remember the hadith that we had earlier in which he says that there will be no shafa'ah for people of ghulu, of religious extremism. To say that only one interpretation is legitimate in anything other than the most basic obligations, 5 prayers a day, one God and so forth, is an innovation unknown to the Salaf. If the Salaf had ikhtilaf amongst themselves, to follow them means that you have to respect the permanency and the legitimacy and the benign nature of ulama of ikhtilaf amongst later generations of Muslims. So, halak al-mutanatti'un, perished be the fanatics, means, amongst other things, perished, or those will certainly perish who try to impose a single interpretation on everybody. And again, we saw what was the fate of the Mu'tazila when they tried to do that, to impose a single shubha by force on the generality of the Muslims. Within a few years, everybody was so disgusted that they walked away. And the Mu'tazila, in the context of the Ahl Sunnah, never really drew breath again. They were around for a few centuries. They weren't subject to persecution, despite what they'd done, but they kind of wandered off into the further deserts of Central Asia, where it was the Mongols who finally wiped them out, not the Sunnis. So this idea of the imposition of a single ideology, which is characteristic of the modern world, totalitarianism, is not the way of Sunni Islam. It is a modernism. The communists, if they didn't kill you for disagreeing with them, would send you to a mental hospital. Only one interpretation was scientific and therefore valid. Everything else was either willful or subversive or treason or a conspiracy or mental illness. That's what a lot of Muslims nowadays would say. So this ideological religion, totalitarian religion, is something that goes naturally with this kind of anxiety-induced fundamentalism. People who are panicky about the complexity of the modern world and treat religion not as a spiritual healing of it or a set of moral templates, but instead as a precise set of fatwa choices set in stone which have to be imposed upon everybody. And the consequences of that are extremely subversive. And again, if you're working with young people who've been damaged by that kind of fundamentalism and are not going to the masjid any longer, one of the things you can do to most help them to relax is by pointing out that respect for diversity is native to Sunni Islam and not some kind of weird concession or modernism. You can almost feel them exhaling in relief when they're told that actually there is wriggle room and that Islam is a family of different interpretations. This is very, very important in our campaign to push back against the tanfiris, those who are frightening people out of the deen. Yeah. So just a final point about this hadith in Sahih Muslim, halak al-mutanatti'un. The Holy Prophet ﷺ is perished be the fanatics, or may the fanatics perish. قالها ثلاثا. He said it 3 times. And if you look this up in Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, he actually explains who the fanatics are. Everybody claims that they're opponents of fanatics and they're moderates, but who actually are the fanatics in the Sharia's judgment? Ibn Rajab says it means those who cling only to the strict outward meaning of the lafz, the expression, like the Zahiriyah, in other words, literalists. This hadith that Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali is specifically refuting the literalists and those who say only one interpretation is valid and it's the most literal interpretation. And that's Ibn Rajab's view. So let's move on a little bit to broaden the screen and look at the 12th in the set of contentions.